Okay, welcome everybody to the fourth and final presentation of the CompTIA Security Plus preparation course. As always with these things, we are going to just give you 2 or 3 minutes for everybody to file into the lecture theatres, as so to speak, and let everything go. So I wish I'd prepared some music to enjoy, but there we go. Everybody can just tell us all good evening, as I can see people are already, and anything that you want to say about the extraordinarily great weather that we're having. I don't know where you are at the moment, but here in Melbourne, it was, I think, 1 degree this morning. That's Celsius for those overseas. So look forward to having a chat. I will come back on in 2 or 3 minutes and formally introduce George and get the ball rolling. But yep. So with all of that, and as we now have over 230 odd people in the session, I would ask George to begin. I'm sure you all know who George is. He's been with us many a year and he has done the other 3 sessions. So how are you?
Thanks, Shane. Yeah, going well. As you pointed out, I'm traveling this week. I have experienced some of Melbourne's snap freeze, or I say snap freeze, but I feel like it's been cold for a little while. Although this morning on my second flight here, um, I have experienced de-icing of a plane, which I have not experienced in Australia before. So I lived in the US for a while and I definitely experienced it there. But to be told we're delayed this morning because we were in a queue to get de-iced was a bit of a surprise. So again, we have a little bit of content to get through tonight, so I won't take too long to get started. Having said that, I know that last week we did go through the lab, and as labs would be, sometimes the lab slash demo gods, although we did get there, took a little bit longer than anticipated. So I apologize again for that. But for anyone that had to drop off or missed it, there, if you haven't seen it already, I did upload some lab instructions and another video of the lab into the learning portal. So check that out. I think it's under module 3. You'll see there's the lab, and then it sort of steps through the downloads and then the commands that we used, and then there's the video which you can step through. And I did pause the recording when it was doing its plug-in thing again, so you don't have to sit there and watch that. So yeah, check that out if you want to go see the lab again. All right, so here we are, week 4. And so I'm pressing buttons and nothing's happening. So in week 4, we're going to take a look at application data and host security. And I think the best place to get started, and we have talked about this a little bit, but probably not to a great amount of detail, but cryptography. And so the reason I'm going to talk about that is because I think it's a fundamental thing that everyone should be aware of, and it applies obviously to information security. It applies to the confidentiality and integrity of information. So cryptography is the control that is most usually associated with that. So protecting the CNI of, and not the only control, but when it comes to protecting the confidential integrity of the CI of the CIA triad, cryptography is definitely one of those controls that is important. The other thing to note, sorry, is I have been a little bit unwell. I've had a bit of a sinus thing going on, so I may periodically need to just mute myself, have a bit of a cough probably, or drink a bit of water. So yeah, apologies for that too.
Why is there no cough button on Zoom?
I don't know. Could probably like, oh, when it does that thing where you speak and you've got it on mute and it goes, "We think you're speaking. Would you like to unmute?" There should be like a, "Hey, we've heard you cough. We've somehow preempted that and muted you." But hey, that would be clever. So cryptographic algorithms. Good old cryptography. I'm not going to go all the way back to, and remember when I did my, actually when I think originally studied for the Security Plus well over a decade ago, or when I was studying for CISSP as well, I remember going through cryptography, and it would always start with things like, the the Caesar cipher and ROT13 and things like that. Very sort of ancient cryptographic algorithms, which in today's day and age would be pretty useless, to be honest. But we're not going to do that. We're going to kind of jump straight into it and talk about the different types of cryptography and some of the uses. So, I mean, in simple terms, cryptography is about taking plain text, so something that is readable to the human eye, or data that is readable, and applying an algorithm to that data, and outputting an encrypted form that is no longer readable or scrambled. So also known as ciphertext. So that is basically what it is. So that anyone that is not authorized to see it cannot see it, or at least it's very difficult to see it. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but so it's about protecting the confidentiality of that information, and we will talk about the integrity piece as well. But primarily we think about confidentiality, and so there are two sort of main types of encryption. There is symmetric encryption and asymmetric. And so I hope, can everybody, no, Shane, you could tell me, can you see the entire diagram? I don't know, because I've got a box over it. I'm hoping Zoom is smart enough to not.
Looks pretty good.
Okay,
looks pretty good.
All right, so symmetric encryption. So encryption in this form, in symmetric or asymmetric, is reversible. Well, encryption is reversible. So, and that's an important thing to note. So when you talk about encryption, there needs to be a way to encrypt and to decrypt. We will talk about hashing, but encryption is reversible. And as it says here, it's based on a key that is only known by authorized person. So think about it like a lock, right? So what happens is you take a piece of data, piece of information, you apply the algorithm, and then you use the key, which is unique and secret, obviously, to lock that data, and then it spits out as a piece of scrambled information. And so there are, various types of, symmetric algorithms. For example, we may have heard of AES, Advanced Encryption System, so AES 256, for example. So that's AES 256-bit key, and that is used to encrypt the data. And as you can see by the diagram here, and I don't know if anyone's seen these two folks before, but Alice and Bob, I think, as long as I can remember, Alice and Bob have been doing demonstrations on encryption. So effectively, with symmetric encryption, there is a key that is shared between the two parties. So Alice will say, I have a piece of information. I'm going to lock that using this key, and I'm going to give the key to Bob. Bob receives the encrypted data. Obviously, as it's being transmitted, it is secure because it's locked. And when Bob receives that, uses the key to unlock the encrypted information and access what's in there. And so that's really, in very simple terms, how that works. Now, symmetric encryption is really useful, and as it says there, for its ability to be fast. And so the way it works is that by having this key exchange, by manually exchanging these keys, and the way the algorithms work, it's very fast and efficient. So if it's about securing large volumes of information, for example, a hard drive filled with information, or a large file, then symmetric encryption is a good choice. The challenge is that you also need to work out how to securely transmit that key. So that's where it can, be a bit trickier. So just remember, if you're talking about size and speed, symmetric encryption, but key exchange. Key length is important because just like anything, the longer the key, the stronger the key. So by being a larger key, it's going to be harder to guess, and it's going to be more protective of what is encrypted. And so it says here, protects against brute force cryptanalysis. So in other words, brute force, and we talked about brute force in the past being trying to guess every single possible combination. Obviously, the bigger and more complex the key, the harder it is going to be to brute force that key. And so it's going to take, as it says, a lot more CPU memory and those sorts of things to do that. So think bigger keys. The catch with larger keys is it starts to impede performance. So if keys are way too big, like if they're massive keys, then there may be impact to performance. Asymmetric encryption. So this is the other type. So in this case, there's no direct key exchange. The way it works is the concept of public and private keys. And so the way that it works is there's a public-private key pair, and the public key is shared with the other party. So in this case, Bob can share the public key with Alice. Alice can then use the public key to encrypt the information and send it back to Bob. Bob then uses the private key that he has to decrypt the information. The public key cannot be used to decrypt the information. So that's how that works. It's useful for small amounts of data. When we talk about things like, when you think about, PKI, that's how that works. And in terms of smaller amounts of information, normally I'd say, does anyone know what a useful small amount of information would be where asymmetric encryption would be useful? The answer, I'm just going to say it. The answer is going to be key exchange is a good way to do that. So if you think about transferring a large file and you need to do a secure key exchange, what you could do, and this is not when I say what you could do, this is usually how it is done, is asymmetric encryption is used to exchange asymmetric key. And so, for example, if you look at something like TLS, so TLS, transport layer security, is the secure method by which internet browsers work. They use a combination of asymmetric and symmetric encryption. So asymmetric to do a key exchange, and then symmetric to when transmitting data. So you get the benefit of being able to share a key without having first shared a key through asymmetric encryption, and then you get the benefit of performance and speed by having shared that symmetric key and using that to transmit the data. Hope I haven't lost anybody, because I'm trying to even get through that in my head. All right. That'll do on that for now. Hashing. So encryption, reversible. You encrypt, you decrypt. Hashing is one way. You hash, and theoretically, you can't unhash. As it says here, it's a fixed length from a variable string. So what that means is if you input a piece of information, the hash will be a certain length, right? So, but if the input is a different length, so for example, you're hashing a different size of input, the output, the hashed output, is still the same length. And it's useful for a few things. It's useful for things like integrity validation. So you probably saw, actually, you may not have seen this because it was in the lab that I recorded. Probably a good reason to go watch it. In the lab that I recorded, I actually added an extra step, which I probably should have in the lab we did last week, but time, which was to check the hashes. And so if you think about the different files, for example, one was Parrot, one was VirtualBox. They are different sizes. So, one's 5 gig and one's like, I don't know, 300 meg. But when you do a hash of that file, the output of both files is the same length. The hashes are different, but the length is the same. And so that's one use for it. The challenge can be, and it talks about collision, is you can end up in some instances with collision, which is where you get two hashes that are the same, but the input's different. I mean, that can happen. It's not likely to happen, but it can happen. And they're used, as I said, for, as it says here, checksums, and it's also used for password storage. So if you think about the way that Microsoft Active Directory works, Microsoft Active Directory, unless you store, and there's a setting that says restore with reversible encryption, in which case it uses encryption. But by default, and the way that it should avoid using reversible encryption, is it stores hashes. And so what it's basically saying is you take a password and you hash it. And then by hashing it, it gets stored in a one-way hash. And when a user logs on, the input also gets hashed and gets compared, and the two hashes get compared. And the idea is that if my saved hash is password X and my entered hash for password X is the same as the saved one, then the password is valid. One of the challenges with Active Directory, for example, is that means that if a threat actor has a database of hashes, so for example, and they can generate them themselves, because you're using a standard algorithm, for example here, SHA-256, the output will always be the same. So password X will hash to the same no matter what system it's in, no matter what Active Directory system it's in. And so that's where you may have seen terms like pass the hash. So taking a hash and then comparing the hash, you can work out what the password is by seeing a hash that's the same if you know what it was before it went in. Whew, that is complicated. There is a concept that Active Directory doesn't use, but many systems use, called salting. Salting is really about adding arbitrary text to the initial password so that when it's hashed, the output's different because it is different, and then storing that separately. And that's a way to prevent pass the hash attacks. I might stop there for a second because that was a lot to digest. Funny that, digest, get it? No. Do you have any questions on that? Does anyone
yeah, we've got a question about, is there a standard for the keys, which I assume there's multiple standards for different sorts of keys?
Do you mean standard length? If it's standard length, again, it's going to be down to, the more complex, the more secure standard. I mean, typically nowadays, a key is going to be probably at the very least 128-bit, but most are going to be around 256-bit. That's typically the length of a key. They do get bigger. So, when we talk about keys that are used for asymmetric certificates, they can be, I think some for generation of certificates, they could be 2048-bit. So it really depends. Yeah, there's one there. So could you re-explain the concept of salting?
Yes, I was just going to ask you that one.
Yeah, so I'm trying to work out if I can, how can I do this? I've got a pen. Okay. I'm going to see if I can try and annotate this thing. This should be fun. Where's the drawer? Okay. So, sorry, now I've got this box in the way. Okay, right. So if I've got, actually, I'm going to start with text tool. Right. So if my password is, I loathe to do this, but let's say it's password 123. Do not set a password as password 123. I'm just doing this for the sake of simplicity. And then you, yeah, and then you apply an algorithm like 256, right? Then what happens, sorry, I made this a bit bigger, is that your output is going to be, and this isn't going to be what the output's going to be, but let's say it's something like that, okay? So it's not going to be that, but let's say it's that. What that means is that every time that password of password 123 is passed through that algorithm, it will always look like that, or whatever it's going to look like. It will always be the same. So what threat actors do is they can either generate these hashes themselves. So they can get a bunch of like words like password 123 and, let me in. They could push it through an algorithm and they can spit out a hash. And what they effectively do is they will create a table of hashed passwords. Then if they get access to a password database, like Active Directory, they can compare. And when they see an entry like that says CNF498 blah blah blah, they will know because they've generated it that equals password 123. So what salting will do is it will add bits into the password, which is transparent to the person that's seeing the password, so they'll never know. And then when you pass it through, you're going to get something completely different. So that's what salting is. So it's about adding arbitrary data to the input to produce a different hash. And that salting, so in this case, the ampersand F1 bit, C, sorry, will be stored somewhere else so that, that is used when the hashes are compared. I hope that makes sense. But basically what it's doing is it's changing the hash, but it's transparent to the user that set their password, so they don't know that that's happened. But it also means that, if you do password 123 and two different people set the same password of password 123, the hashes will be different, which means that the salting will be different, which means that the two hashes will be different, so they can't be compared.
This is really why we're being told always to use different passwords for everything. Because if somebody picks up a password from somewhere and they've got the access to the hash, then they can reuse that anywhere.
Well, it's why, yeah, sort of. I was going to say it's why we're told not to reuse passwords, but also to make them very unique and complicated. Because the common ones, threat actors will already have the hash for it. So if I went into a hash table, guaranteed password 123's hash is already in there. So someone's put a comment there, hashing is one way, right? In your opinion, is there a way to decrypt in the near future? Well, it's not encryption, it's hashing. So you can't decrypt it, but what you can do is do the other way, where you generate hashes. So you don't decrypt a hash. What you do is you generate another hash to see if you get a match. So it's a bit different. So that's how the hashing brute forcing would work. You just keep guessing passwords, hashing them until you get a matching hash. So yeah, a little bit different.
Yeah. One last question, which is, can you again explain TLS, the combination of asymmetric and symmetric encryption in the one transaction?
Yeah, so TLS is transport layer security, which is which is, I guess, the sort of standard way to secure connections over unsecure networks. So if you remember, many years ago, SSL was introduced, secure socket layer. The sort of evolution of that is TLS, which is creating that encrypted tunnel, so to speak. And so the way that the encryption piece works there is you need a key exchange. You always need to, you need keys when it comes to encryption. So with the way TLS works is it uses an asymmetric key exchange, because you don't need to share the key. The public key is actually available because it's public. So the way that works is say the server. So let's look at a web server, for example, uses TLS to communicate. So when you go to HTTPS blah on a web server, that is a TLS tunnel, most likely. I mean, it could be SSL, which would be very bad because that's not secure, but hypothetically, it's a not hypothetically, but should be a TLS tunnel. And so the client accesses the server and can access the public key. And the way that it works then is the data is transmitted, and then that key is used. The client sends a key back to the server, which then gets decrypted. So it's encrypted by the client using public key. The server decrypts that key using its private key. Now there's a key exchange, and that key is now used to encrypt the subsequent traffic using symmetric encryption, because a key exchange has actually occurred. So if you think the asymmetric part does the initial key exchange, Then there's symmetric keys, which are then used for the data transfer. What informed the version of TLS and what's differentiation TLS 1.1, 1.2, 1.3? I mean, those are just different versions of the same type of protocol. Version 1, version 2, version 3, they're just revisions of it. TLS 1 is no longer considered secure. So obviously there's been improvements and so forth. And then the latest iteration is 1.3. So it's just different versions of TLS, increasing in security due to the evolution of the protocol. All right. Right. We should keep going because we're not far yet.
Absolutely.
We're not far yet. Touch on this really quick. Digital signatures. I'm just going to get rid of this thingy here. Digital signatures. So this is around basically a digital certificate that's shared. A digital certificate can be used to sign something. For example, sign an email. You could sign an email with a digital certificate. It's issued to, for example, Alice. Alice signs it, sends it, and what it does is it provides, as it says here, integrity, authentication, and non-repudiation. So integrity saying, okay, well, Alice has signed it using her certificate, therefore it hasn't been tampered with. If it gets to the destination and the certificate's intact, it hasn't been tampered with. For example, if you ever used an email certificate and you have something in between, like a mail filtering system that tampers with the email, the email will come through blank because it's no longer has its integrity that it had before. If you look at something like non-repudiation, if Alice sends me an email and signs it and it comes to me intact, providing, it's signed by Alice digitally, then non-repudiation says that Alice can't deny that Alice sent it to me. So the other way is that if there's an exchange of certificates between Alice and Bob, so Alice sends Bob her certificate and Bob sends Alice his certificate, that can then be used to do encryption. So because there's been a exchange of keys. But anyway, I should keep moving because we are going to run out of time. This was meant to be the fundamental on encryption, and we haven't actually got to the beefy part yet. Oh, now we have. Cool. Endpoint security. So endpoint hardening. So what is hardening? Hardening is basically shrinking the threat surface on a device. So we talk about endpoint here. So operating system security. So workstations, servers, talking about baseline configurations. What this really is, and the problem I have here is I've got only a single screen, so I can't see what slide's coming up next. So if you look at hardening, that doesn't have that. This is, and in this instance here, it's using something like group policy objects to apply certain settings. And so when we think about hardening, it's about, disabling unused services, closing ports that aren't required, disabling legacy protocols. Those are examples of hardening activities that can be done. There are resources like the Center for Internet Security, CIS, that publish like the CIS benchmarks. Those contain, and you can, so non-commercial, you can download those for free. I think you have to sign up, but you can download the CIS benchmarks and they provide guidance on these are the things that you should do to harden, e.g. Windows 11, Windows Server 2022, Microsoft 365, Azure VMs, all that sort of stuff. That's contained within that documentation. So it'll be things like, disable, like I'm trying to think of, disable NT4 backwards compatibility type stuff and things like that. I do know that the CIS benchmark for Windows 11 or Windows 10 is like 800 pages. So it's quite a bit to go through there. In doing things like enabling BitLocker disk encryption is a hardening activity. In terms of protecting endpoints, there's the principle of least privilege, POLP. In other words, only allowing the minimum rights required, in other words, not giving everybody admin. It's also one of the essential A controls. But that is something that applies to endpoint protection. It actually applies to everything when you relate to security. Like only provide the access that is required. Access control lists are a way to achieve least privilege. So, locking things down. so that can't happen, which also goes into file system permissions, making sure that there's monitoring, enforcing configuration, going back to the baselining. Group policy is a great way to do that in a Windows environment, which I just realized is written like right underneath it. But yeah, that's sort of protecting the endpoint from a configuration perspective. Oh, weird. Here we go. Hiding techniques. I feel like that might be out of place. So protecting physical ports. What that means is like stopping the ability for people to plug in USB sticks, USB flash drives. So, you could physically, I don't know if that's a great idea, but I mean, some organizations do it. They actually block the port up so it can't be used. Having said that, a lot of keyboards and stuff now use USB. So usually software is done. So software is used to restrict the ability to connect or write to a USB device. So sometimes it's for data leakage prevention purposes. So if it's read only, and then sometimes it's so that it can't read it at all, so that malware can't be distributed by USB keys, for example. You have different encryption controls, full disk encryption, which is encrypting the entire storage device that is within the piece of hardware. Removable media encryption, which is, let's say hypothetically plug in a USB flash drive and it's allowed, but it requires it to be encrypted before it can be written to. That's a way to potentially harden the use of virtual private networks for transmitting data securely over networks, or also over untrusted networks like the internet. And then, things like email encryption for, which we talked about a little bit with the digital certificates, but there's other ways to that as well to prevent interception of emails. You've also got the concept of host-based firewalls and IPS. So if you think about host-based, that means on an actual host. So like a computer or a server, Windows Defender or Windows Firewall are examples of host-based firewalls and IPS, which do also lend themselves to things like endpoint protection. So that's your antivirus, anti-malware type stuff. Changing defaults, so not having default, admin password type stuff, and removing unnecessary software. So does it actually need to be there? Because software can have vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities can be exploited by a threat actor. I'm going to pause there for a second, have a quick sip of water, and then any questions?
Sorry, I'm just laughing at, you've explained salting. Would you be able to explain pepper?
Like pink peppercorns, green peppercorns.
I don't know. I'm assuming it might have had a relevance. If it doesn't, let's move on.
That makes you sneeze.
Can you give an example of a tool to enforce or manage server hardening?
Yeah, so group policy, it depends on the environment, but in a Windows environment, which is obviously a very common environment, group policy objects are used a lot. Microsoft Intune, if anyone that has that, can be used as well. That will enforce hardening, and then you can use, we talked about vulnerability management tools maybe a couple of weeks ago. Was that last week? I don't remember. Vulnerability management tools, the not free ones generally, although if anyone does find a free tool that does this, please let me know. But some of the more sort of commercial tools have also the ability to validate those configurations. So, we talked about, Tenable, Rapid7. I think some of those have the ability to validate a machine against, for example, the CIS benchmarks and say, yes, this meets these requirements. So there's two parts. One is that enforcement, so e.g. group policy object, Intune. And then the second part is the validation and monitoring of that.
Okay. You mentioned that digital signatures provide integrity, authentication, non-repudiation. Why do some banks? Actually, I think might skip this question because I think it's a confusion about digital certificates and digital signatures. I think they're different things. Let's move on from that. Sorry, Alex. How can you undo salting when you need to?
Salting. So the salt is actually stored separately. So there's a record that again is transparent to invisible to the person that that's, for example, we talk about an authentication system. There's a separate record that would be able to store the salt and have something to say that salt belongs to that particular record so that it could be re-injected into that record to do the hash comparison. So in other words, it's stored elsewhere. So it's not undone. It has to be redone every time that particular user, for example, or that particular record is accessed. The salt needs to be pulled out, reapplied, hashed, and then go, yep, it matches.
Okay. Isabel's asked, peppering actually seems to be similar to salting before hashing. I would imagine she's asking if it's used commonly. I would guess not if you've not.
I've never used peppering.
Right. There we go.
Good to know.
Let's move on for the moment, I think.
Okay. Mobile device security. So very similar to hardening machines, although I would probably say that mobile devices are probably more often lost. There is the concept of BYOD. So bring your own device. So many organizations may allow you to bring your own mobile or your own mobile, or yeah, bring your own device. And then they can, deploy what we call mobile device management. So mobile device management, or MDM, is basically which is similar to the question before about how can you enforce stuff. MDM provides the ability for an organization to apply controls to the particular device. And that may be the entire device, it may be a section of the device, it may be particular apps within the device. And it could be things like enforcing, full device encryption, remote wiping, location services, so if the phone's like lost, it can help locate the phone. Obviously, depending on if it's a BYOD, the policies tend to be a little less aggressive because obviously there's usually some expectation of some level of control of the device by the owner, but usually for corporate owned devices they tend to have the full kind of gamut of controls applied. So full device encryption in external media. So in iOS, so for anyone that has an Apple device, there are various levels of encryption. If you set a passcode on your device, you have it encrypts the storage within the device. So the flash storage or solid state that says there is encrypted, which is good. Some particular apps will have another level of encryption over the top of that. So even though the storage device itself is encrypted, the app may have a second round of encryption. So I always recommend setting your passcodes and stuff like that. It used to be that you had to enforce it, but now I think it's by default on iOS, at least since probably iOS, oh my God, like 5 or 6, it's a default setting. I talked about location services, so using the GPS within with GPS capabilities within the phone can be used to locate the phone. You could see here there's an example of some of those GPS settings available in Microsoft Azure, which will be in tune, and being able to create those settings and apply them to the device from there. As it says down the bottom, the primary concern of location services is privacy, because if you've got a corporate managed device and GPS location services is on, then obviously the organization could probably see where you are, which is why usually if it's a BYOD, it's not uncommon to see some of those services switched off just for privacy reasons and things like that. And I'm not going to get into the privacy law, but certainly that's something that should be considered and, question for legal about, monitoring and things like that. Not one for me. So you got Wi-Fi and tethering. So as I said, I'm going to skip through this because we are really running out of time. So mobile devices usually default to using a Wi-Fi connection. So if one is available, a mobile device will try to connect to it, especially if it has, and there is a setting that says, prompt, but if a mobile device typically has connected to a Wi-Fi SSID before and it sees it, it will try to connect to it. And so you'll see here, there's a comment about like rogue/evil twin networks. So it's not uncommon for a threat actor to pretend to be a well-known, for example, public network, I don't know. I know it was in the US, Starbucks Wi-Fi, Staples Wi-Fi. Pretending to be that particular network, and there are devices out there. I think we talked briefly about pineapples. Um, they can mimic that device, and so when a phone goes looking for Staples Wi-Fi, because it's in the list of known networks, it connects to it, but it's actually a malicious access point, which at that point data could potentially be intercepted and accessed. So there needs to be some consideration around whether letting public networks is a thing that should be done, or what sort of caution should make sure VPN tunnels are established to try and protect that traffic.
Didn't a guy in Western Australia here get convicted last week of imitating airport Wi-Fi
That wouldn't
and
surprise me.
harvesting?
I missed that, but that would not surprise me.
And it was quite a high-profile case just in the last week or so.
It's something that, as a penetration tester, obviously with express permission from the organization, you may do to test people's awareness and things like that. So it's not hard to do, but yes, obviously very illegal.
I think actually Naomi's just posted an article about it. I think that's the same one.
Yeah. So, and that's where the use of a secure tunnel over that would help protect that. Now, when I say secure tunnel, you got to be careful, because something like TLS, for example, can be intercepted. There are ways to tell, because the certificate will not. An example is, if I go to a banking website, say I go to ANZ, and I look at the certificate would be issued to ANZ Banking Corporation, whatever it is, or Australian New Zealand Bank, whatever it is. If you have a threat actor that is intercepting that connection and doing what we call like a SSL decrypt, so they're basically breaking the connection, doing a decrypt, looking at the traffic, re-encrypting it, and passing it on, so it looks like there's nothing wrong, the certificate won't match. It won't say Australian New Zealand Banking Corporation. It'll say something completely wrong. And you do see that in legitimate scenarios too. So if you think about corporate networks that do SSL decrypt for the purposes of detecting whether a website's malicious or compliance, sometimes you see that. So I've seen instances where someone's deployed, Cisco Umbrella, and it's for legitimate purposes. It's to help protect the organization. And what it does is that if you look at the certificate, it'll say issued to Cisco Umbrella, not to where you think you're meant to go. Organizations that do that will, and I'm going to say usually, all times I've seen, create exceptions for things like banking, medical, government, etc., because they don't want to be that might get them into a bit of trouble. But certainly for the run-of-the-mill, random websites out there, they'll do the inspection, because the challenge is now with encryption. Encryption protects the confidentiality of information, which also means that if there's malicious activity, it protects that too. So that's why that feature is available on many firewalls, for example, so that they can inspect it and go, yep, no, there's nothing malicious here, pass it through. It's not a person doing it, it's a machine going, oh, yeah, no, that looks fine. But just bear that in mind. But that, again, is the same way that these threat actors can intercept the traffic. It's using the same methods. But you have to connect to the dodgy device. And then we're on network security. Sorry, there's some questions there. Can the blocking USB ports be configured via GPO? Yes, it can. It can absolutely be done. VPNs can be used to perform malicious activity. Yes, they can. Just like a VPN is used to protect your, I guess, what are you doing? It can be used by threat actors to hide where they are and to protect their transactions. So, yes.
Stephen's asking if removing unnecessary software is a way of hardening. I assume that preventing installation of software is a way of hardening in the first instance.
Correct.
I guess that's why you don't give people admin rights.
That's the least privileged one. Yeah, absolutely.
There's a couple of questions on, how to implement salting with hashing. Is that something within the scope of what you can answer in this?
What was that about salting?
It just practically how to implement it, to implement salting and hashing.
Oh, that's a bit detailed.
Yeah, I thought it might
Like
be.
I've done it. I've done it when building systems in .NET. I'm not going to rip open .NET now and sort of do that.
Yeah,
But effectively, as I said, there'd be a repository or a table that would contain the secured salt, and then something that corresponds to the record that it's salting, and then you apply. Yeah, it's a bit complicated, but you just got to think of, you've got your records, you've got your salt. There's a link between the two so that it knows which one's which, and then go from there. But yeah, I don't really have time to.
no worries. Wi-Fi pineapple attack on the plane. Or is that just a reference to a news article?
Well, no, that would be a way to do that. So if you had a, a pineapple is a device by a company called Hack5, I think that's what they're called. Um, that is designed to do wireless penetration testing. And so, yes, something like that could be used potentially to do that, mimic a, a public network, which is why I always exercise caution on public networks. Now that made everybody paranoid, for good reason. So hardening switches and routers, again, very, very similar. You see the theme here between mobile and endpoint and switches and routers. It's turn on logging, get rid of defaults, disable the unnecessary stuff. It's all the same. It just applies to different context, but the same. Um, this one is probably a little bit less about security from a protection perspective, but more from a performance perspective. You know, placement of wireless access points. So there's a couple of considerations here from a security perspective. Obviously, placing them so that they're within the bounds and not broadcasting too far out, because then you've got threat actors on the street trying to get in. But also from a performance perspective, there are tools out there. I can't quite see what that says. Wi-Fi scanner. There's one called Network Inspector. I think that's free. Kali and Parrot also have some Wi-Fi tools that can help, with placement and getting rid of sort of black spots and channel conflicts and things like that. For example, when I lived in the US, my Wi-Fi was really bad, and I popped open a Wi-Fi tool like this, and I was able to see that there was like a ton of Wi-Fi networks on channel 7. So I just moved to a different channel, and my Wi-Fi just went like 5 times faster because of those clashes. So yeah, good to sort of see that. Also very useful for doing a survey of what Wi-Fi access points are around. You can use that to detect rogue access points and things like that. So really useful to do. In terms of wireless encryption, open, not really encrypted. Open networks, yeah, not that useful. Usually you'll find when there's an open network, there's usually a secondary control to protect that network. Otherwise, with an open network, everyone can just kind of join it freely. Traffic's broadcast across the network. If that traffic's not encrypted, it can be easily seen by anybody. So yeah, the least secure version. Again, accessing an open network, I would recommend a secondary method of protection, like a VPN tunnel or something like that. WEP is probably, I don't know if anyone's seen WEP recently. That's kind of a more older wireless encryption method. I think it's got some vulnerabilities, so I probably wouldn't use that. I'll skip down to WPS's wireless provisioning. That's just about kind of making it a bit easier to get on the Wi-Fi networks. But WPA 2 and 3 are typically the most common sort of methods used now to connect to wireless networks. I mean, most of you are probably familiar with WPA 2. You see on the right there, WPA2 PSK, which is pre-shared key. Funnily enough, an example of symmetric encryption. So key is shared and then used to encrypt the data. So WPA 2, 3, which is, again, newer version of that. Oopsie, what's happened there? Yeah. And Yeah, it's a appreciate key is usually used for, as I said, where you're sharing the key to get access to it. In larger organizations, that may not be very practical, which is where you start to see things like WPA 2/3 enterprise. And this is where you're starting to use things like certificates and radius servers to authenticate. So you're not sharing a key around and saying, hey, everybody, here's the key, go join that. You're actually relying on configuration of the device. For example, a Windows device getting issued with a certificate that's then used to authenticate to the network. So a way to kind of bulk on board folks to the network. Also, if there's no key to get out, so you can't have and there's no key to guess, because that's the other thing, right? If the key's bad because it's easy, like it's let me in 123, it's going to be brute forced pretty quickly. That can be prevented with WPA with enterprise versions. Again, that doesn't mean they're immune. There are ways to attack these types of networks, but more complicated, a lot more complicated, a lot more difficult. Network access control, what this is it basically makes sure that device is authenticated before getting access to network resources. So, if my device plugs in, so if you go to an organization that has NAC enabled, you go to plug in, and you don't have a device that has the ability to authenticate, again, usually by certificates or so forth, the device won't connect to the network. Yes, the light will turn on, but that's it. You won't get access to any resources. So NAC helps prevent the ability for someone just to walk in and plug in a network cable. Again, potentially there's ways to get around that, but a lot more difficult than just plugging in a cable. What how many of these we got left? We're a bit short on time. So intrusion detection and prevention, host-based, network-based. So intrusion detection is about identifying that an intrusion or suspicious traffic has occurred, but intrusion detection doesn't do anything about it besides throw an alert. Intrusion prevention has the ability to prevent that transaction or that event from happening. And so when you think about network-based, intrusion detection, like Snort, for example, sits off to the side, takes a mirrored copy of the data, analyzes it, and then works out that something bad's happened, but it's very passive in that respect. It detects. Intrusion prevention sits in line. So if you imagine like a gate, imagine like a driveway with a gate. And so if it detects that something malicious is happening, it has the ability to close the gate and stop that event from happening. So that's the difference between IDS and IPS. And there's different ways it does that. So signature-based means it has seen that type of activity before. Maybe it's a piece of malware that has a particular signature, usually, funnily enough, hash-based, and it enforces a rule. Anomaly-based is that it sees something that's odd. So an odd behavior as well would be an anomaly, and it triggers or closes its gate. And trending might be if it sees something particular or some stuff happening over a point in time, for example, and it sees a trend, and then it may again determine that it's malicious, and it will either do something, throw an alert, or if an IPS, prevent that traffic. Web filtering, talked about this a little bit before, but basically pretty straightforward. So web filtering, as you can imagine, filters web traffic designed to block malware, enforce policies. There are different ways that it does that. It can scan URLs, it can inspect traffic. There might be specific rules that say if you go to a website that's to do with hacking, block it. Reputation based. So for example, if the website's only been around for like 5 minutes, it can block that. If it's we talk about things like high entropy. So high entropy is where you have got like a domain that has a lot of randomness in it. So for example, xyz123457.4.com, it's a bit of an odd domain, would be a high entropy domain. Could potentially block that. So and it says down the bottom here, decrypting and inspecting HTTPS traffic, which is what I was talking about before. All right. Application security. I think we're almost there. So secure protocols. So you see on the left here, we have insecure protocols, Telnet, HTTP, FTP, and the secure alternative. SSH, HTTPS, FTPS, SFTP. So the difference between the left and the right is really encryption. So encryption is used on the right, it is not used on the left. That is that's the punchline. So by employing encryption, you get a more secure alternative to what you have on the left. So Telnet, commonly used to manage servers, SSH, secure version, HTTPS. In fact, if you go into like Chrome now, for example, and you go to a HTTP website, so one that doesn't have the S, you get a not secure pop-up in the address bar. And then FTP, used for transferring files commonly. So yeah, those ones on the left, as it says there, they transmit in clear text, so it can be readable by anybody. The example before, if you're at a public open Wi-Fi and you go to a website and it's HTTP, that data traffic is readable for anyone that is on that network. So it's broadcasted, and anyone that has a sniffer can see that. HTTPS, no. TLS, we talked about briefly. I probably won't get into too much more detail on this. Key things: only use TLS version 1.2 or newer. Disable all others, because downgrade is an option. So a threat actor can request a downgrade from TLS 1.2 to a less secure protocol if it is not disabled, which makes it vulnerable. For anyone that's going through something like PCI compliance, if you've got those lower versions enabled, it will throw a fail, because it'll say, well, there's a downgrade attack possibility, which would make the cardholder data potentially not secure if it's transmitted, and therefore fail PCI. So make sure 1.2 or newer is enabled. We sort of talked about this already. Email. So a couple things. Now, there are two things to note here. So one is about accessing mail and one is about sending mail. SMTP is about mail transmission. So sending mail between mail servers is SMTP, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. It's clear text by default, and that's all it does. It sends email between email servers. SMTP, so that's SMTP is TCP port 25, if anyone that's wondering. SMTPS is generally, I think, TCP port 587, but it is the encrypted version, which is what is preferred. Open relay means that anybody can send through an SMTP server, which is used often to send spam. So there should be authentication methods in place to prevent anybody from just sending through an SMTP server. If that's not configured, it becomes an open relay, and that SMTP server is most likely to get abused and used to send junk and scams and all sorts of stuff. POP and IMAP, Post Office Protocol, and I can't remember what IMAP stands for, Internet Mail Application Protocol, maybe, I don't know, is used for accessing mail. Again, those are clear text by default, and POP-S and IMAP-S are the preferred ways to deal with that. There are a few controls around email security. Big one is SPF, so Sender Policy Framework. And the catch here, and this, I think many places will now use SPF. One of the challenges with SPS, if you have it enabled and you forget to put the correct entries in, or you get a new system that sends mail on behalf of your domain and you don't put the record in properly, good chance it's going to get flagged as junk. So easy way to check, well, let's do a, it's not really a lab, but NS lookup, my friend. So so a SPF record is a DNS record. It's stored in the text field. If I go to, let's have a look. Well, surely IT Masters has one. Oops, my bad. Set type equals text. Okay. Obviously, these are just public records. Okay, so you see here. So this record here, V equals SPF1, lists all of the servers that are authorized to send mail on behalf of the itmasters.edu.au domain. So you could see like Mimecast and Google and whatever. If tomorrow it was decided to, I don't know if it's out. I don't think so. To go, let's go use Salesforce and get it to send mail, and it wasn't added to here, then almost guaranteed it'd probably end up in the junk mailbox in most places. So it's a good way to make sure that mail servers are authorized. That is an SPF record, and that's how you could check it. So if you find a lot of your mails going to junk, if you manage a domain, check that you've got the SPF record created. More commonly now, DKIM and DMARC. This is about digitally signing mail within. It happens at server side. You create a you enable these records. You've got to publish some records within DNS, and the mail server will then attach that. And again, if not configured correctly, mail will get rejected. It goes to junk, all that sort of stuff. So if you turn these things on, they need to be configured properly. Otherwise, things don't quite work properly. Email gateway, really, it's like web filtering, but for email. It does things like scan for malicious attachments and malicious links and phishing and all that sort of stuff, spam, malware, all that sort of thing. That's just the purpose of an email gateway. I think that's it. Yeah. And then finally, email DLP is around data leakage prevention for email. So we talked about DLP in a network context and classifying data. And this is just applying it to email. So when someone emails something out and it doesn't meet a policy requirement, so for example, they email out PII, credit card data, something commercially sensitive, having DLP controls to prevent that. That's what email DLP is. And many email platforms will allow that within their configuration. So for example, Microsoft 365 has DLP capabilities within some certain licenses. So I think E3, for example, E5, will have DLP capabilities. So you could say, well, if it's classified as internal use only, don't let it go out. If it contains PII, don't let it go out. If it contains more than, well, could be one, or 3 or 5 credit card numbers, don't let it go out, and do something, alert somebody, block it, take whatever action. And that's it. Wow. Okay. That is it. Questions?
So I'll remind everybody to send their questions through because we won't be holding it open forever. What happens when I use 2 old switches on my network? Is it dangerous? Is there a way to continue to use them?
I mean, that's a bit subjective, I guess. If you say too old because they are no longer supported by the vendor and there's no longer security patches, then possibly. I mean, I can't answer that without knowing a lot more. I'm going to say possibly. It depends on how they're used. Is there, can they be publicly exploited, or are we talking about, an air gap network? And then you've got the whole maintenance thing. We think about information security, we think about confidential integrity and availability. So if they're too old and then they fail, that technically is a security issue because the service is no longer available. So, yeah, depends.
What about EAP, which I assume he's not asking about employee assistance programs?
No, that's extensible access protocol. What is that? That was on there.
Okay.
And yeah, look, and the other question there, 802.1x, an example of a network access control. It is an 802.1.x is a network access control.
It's an over-the-air protocol, isn't it? For wireless.
Oh no, that's I'm blank. See, I'm tired. No, it's that's ABG type stuff. What is that again? 811, 80 It's very similar, but it's not. 802.1x is port authentication type stuff.
Okay. What's the difference between Microsoft Modern Authentication and Common Auth method?
It's a bit random. In terms of so I mean, Modern Auth is the current authentication method that Microsoft recommend doing. I don't know the intricacies of what makes it different. I know the flow is slightly different and it's meant to be more secure, and usually involved with multi-factor and those sorts of things, but I don't know the exact answer of what the differences are between those two methods. I know that Microsoft recommend you do Modern Auth. I know there's compatibility issues with Modern Auth with some of the legacy apps. I think the key thing is that it's probably a more secure method of authentication. But yeah, certainly probably need to dig a bit more into that one.
What's the difference between TPM 1.2 and 2.0?
Again, we're talking about iterations of the same thing. So for anyone that's so TPM is Trusted Platform Module from memory, which is a hardware chip that sits inside a piece of like a laptop, for example, which is used to store encryption keys. So when you boot up a machine that's BitLocked, it accesses the TPM and pulls the key out, which allows the machine to then boot. Again, when we talk about differences, it's probably going to be well outside of what I'm going to have on the top of my head. It's going to be just a newer, probably more secure version of that. But yeah, that's definitely one that I'm probably going to have to Google to get an exact answer. So I know what a TPM is, but what the exact difference is between the two versions, I'm not sure.
Right.
If someone else knows, feel free to answer.
Yes, feel free to bung it in the chat, everybody. There's a lot of conversation going on in the chat tonight, which is fantastic. What about the hardening of network printers, IoT devices, and other peripherals? Same deal, disable and lock down where applicable?
Yeah, well, again, you got to think about so network printer, you can't disable everything, otherwise it probably won't work. But yeah, again, there's probably going to be default configurations to get access to the admin pieces of it. Make sure that those are disabled. You might want to limit where it could be accessed from. To be honest, it's probably going to be also stuff around the switching infrastructure and whether it's on a specific printer VLAN. But for the device itself, I don't think there's probably going to be limited things to harden on a printer. But yeah, anything that's not required. So there might be multiple protocols that are used to communicate with the printer. If they're unnecessary and say you only need TCP/IP, then disable the rest of them. But again, there's going to have to be testing and so forth, so you don't break stuff.
And things like a good IoT network is normally set up in its own central virtual LAN, or for want of a better term, or VPN. Most of the ones that are set up across mobile phone networks are all set up on their own VPN effectively. They're given a subnet and it's secure because they have a tunnel into it and it's secured by the network itself.
Well, and if we look at IoT, think about like the Mirai botnet that went around about 7, 8 years ago. Like it basically fed off default configuration IoT devices.
Right.
So again, which then kind of triggered the maybe we should make all the passwords the same sort of thing. So it's the same thing. Make sure that it's limited, what can access it, make sure default configurations are gone, and those sorts of things.
The questions about email scanners.
How does email work?
Well,
How do they work? So they usually sit in line. So if you think about, maybe we can do an annotate here. So if you think about an email scanner, you've got some other little fluffy cloud here. So email comes in, and then scanners here, and it gets scanned, and then mail server is here, and it goes like this, and then person is here with their Outlook client on there. I love my drawing. That's a laptop. Kind of like that. So at this point, it sits in line. So it comes from the cloud to the internet to the email scanner, which analyzes the email, checks it for malicious links, malware, anything kind of dodgy, any rules that it might breach, and then forwards it to the mail server, which you then go on your device. So that's basically how an email scanner works. Are there vulnerabilities? Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the device itself could be vulnerable if it's obviously sitting public to the internet. You can't guarantee it's going to get everything. So, often, you've probably seen spam sometimes gets missed. Think about those sorts of things. So there are definitely potential drawbacks, but nothing's 100%, but that's sort of how it works.
Okay, we've reached the end of the questions, which is kind of nice at this time of the evening. There is one question that Samuel's asking about during the lab. My Nessus is asking for activation. Was there activation needed? Does that ring a bell?
Yeah. So that was which is why we got stuck last week, because I started on the activation screen. Um, you have to activate, and I recommended, I can't remember what it was, but it was the free one for non-commercial use. Um, if you look at the video, it shows you in there. You do have to provide an email address, so you could just make a temporary one or whatever. But yes, you do need to activate that way. So, but there is a free option, so you can scan. I think it's up to 16 IPs for non-commercial home use, if you like. But yeah, it's almost at the start of the video, I think. So once the Nessus has been installed, it's almost one of the first steps to go through the activation process.
Great. Well, thank you, George. I think hopefully we have shut down questions now, Kit. If that's there, we've closed it, as you can see. Thank you, everybody, for coming along tonight. Thank you, George, for a really good overview. How would you say, how much extra would people have to do now before they can have some hope of attempting CompTIA Security Plus? There's a fair way to go, I would imagine.
Well, it depends on what knowledge you already have as well. So there is a fair bit to go. As you probably worked out, I speak quite fast, and there's still quite a bit of content, and you can obviously go deeper into some of the information that I've covered. So I would definitely recommend doing additional study. If you can get your hands on the study guide from CompTIA, I would recommend that. Um, I think this will give you a good foundation, but definitely, I think sort of, sort of 30 to 40 hours of study probably, would be not, not unheard of, I think, to get up to scratch. Again, depending on what sort of experience you already have. If you're already quite experienced in the field, then, you might be okay. But yeah, if it's something that's fairly new, there is still a bit more content to cover.
Yeah, and it's worthwhile mentioning as well that people who actually hold the CompTIA Security Plus certificate can get a credit in one or more of our subjects. I can't remember exactly which one it is that we credit for it, but it is an offer there in terms of our paid courses and masters and graduate certificates in cybersecurity. So there is some value in doing those courses above and beyond doing them themselves in your work, that we can look at doing that. And if you're doing other industry certificates, I saw some people talking about doing different ones in the chat earlier on. There are other things that you could get credits for within our courses as well. We like to not force you to learn the same things twice as part of our principles in what we do. But again, as I was saying, thanks very much, George. A big thanks to Kit, who I forgot to mention earlier on in the system, but has been valiantly working through the chat, which has been going great guns tonight. I'd also encourage everybody to participate in the forums, and anything you've still got outstanding, keep the chat going in the forums, because a lot of stuff comes up in there and a lot of answers from all of the crew that are around. And Kit has been twisting my arm, George, to ask you about Hackers, the movie.
What about
If
it?
you'd seen it, what you thought of it.
Well,
It's a very old movie.
I know. Yeah. Is it accurate? You mean like, is it accurate?
Kit
No.
thought it was whack.
Who said it was whack?
Kit thought it was whack.
Yeah, it's not quite. To be honest, I think that probably the closest thing is that I've seen is probably, it's definitely not Swordfish. It's probably Mr. Robot. I think, and many of you probably have seen it. I think it's probably the closest that I've seen. And even then, I mean, very, very sped up. I mean, typically when you're doing that stuff, it takes a long time, but it'd be pretty boring to sit there and watch someone trying to get into something for like 3 days. So, yeah, but yeah, good soundtrack though. Great soundtrack on Hackers. I'll give it that.
Maybe SBS could do a slow TV version. Just somebody trying a million passwords. Anyway, that's enough of that from me. And again, I hope everybody has a good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And we look forward to seeing you in our next short course, which will be available in around about a month. And I think it's going to be on digital marketing this time. But otherwise, this course will be available for some time to come. Feel free to log on, re-enter the course, look at the videos, download the exams, and participate. Thanks again. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Cheers.